What if the life of a Hollywood legend ended in a way no one could have imagined? What if the man who brought us some of the most iconic films of our time and his beloved wife were gone, and the truth behind their deaths was far darker than anyone ever suspected? This is not a story about the glitz and glamour of Tinseltown. This is about tragedy, betrayal, and a mystery that would shock the world. Rob Reiner, the filmmaker whose name is synonymous with cinematic brilliance, and Michelle Reiner, his life partner and confidant, were found dead in their Los Angeles mansion. The news sent shockwaves across Hollywood, across the United States, across the globe. Fans couldn't believe it. Neighbors were horrified. And then, the unimaginable. Their son, Nick Reiner, had been arrested. Nick had confessed to what authorities called an abomination. A crime so incomprehensible that it made everyone stop and ask, how could this happen? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner, 78, was a titan of film. He directed classics that shaped generations, from the satirical genius of This Is Spinal Tap to the courtroom intensity of A Few Good Men and the heartfelt storytelling of Stand By Me. His work was loved not just for its entertainment value, but because it touched something deeply human, the struggles, the humor, the pain, and the triumphs we all experience. Michelle, 68, was the partner who stood quietly beside him, the one who anchored his world in ways the public never fully understood. She was not just a wife. She was a pillar, a confidant, a voice of reason in the whirlwind of Hollywood fame. The morning of their deaths began like any other for the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Los Angeles. But by mid-morning, police cars were swarming the mansion. Reporters gathered, cameras flashing, helicopters hovering above. Friends and colleagues called, frantic for answers. Social media erupted. Was it a break-in? A tragic accident? Or something far more sinister? And then came the chilling revelation. It was not an intruder, not a random tragedy. It was someone from inside the family. Nick Reiner, the son of Rob and Michelle, had been taken into custody. Details were initially scarce, but as the investigation unfolded, authorities confirmed that Nick had confessed. He had admitted to committing the act that had shattered one of Hollywood's most respected families. The very idea sent shockwaves through a community that had always seen the Reiners as the picture of success, stability, and love. How could a son, raised in the lap of privilege, in a household filled with creativity and guidance, commit such a horrific act? What could drive someone to destroy the very people who brought them into this world, nurtured them, and loved them unconditionally? To understand this tragedy, we need to look beyond the headlines, beyond the flashing cameras and the social media outcry, and into the intricate, complex world that Rob and Michelle lived in. Rob Reiner was not just a director. He was a man who carried the weight of expectation, both self-imposed and from the world around him. He was a man who balanced creativity with public scrutiny, humor with seriousness, and family obligations with the relentless demands of Hollywood. Michelle, in her own quiet way, managed to support all of this while maintaining a semblance of normalcy within their home. Together, they created a life that seemed enviable, flawless even, to outsiders. And yet, as the investigation would reveal, appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the polished surface, there were tensions, resentments, and conflicts that had been festering for years. Conflicts that no one, not neighbors, not coworkers, not fans, could see. It's a stark reminder that tragedy rarely announces itself in the form of red flags that are obvious to the outside world. Sometimes, the darkest storms brew quietly, behind closed doors, until they explode in ways that leave everyone reeling. Imagine the scene on that fateful morning. The mansion, stately and serene, suddenly transformed into the epicenter of a nightmare. Emergency responders moving quickly, neighbors peering from behind their curtains, and the local press trying to make sense of the unthinkable. And then there's the public reaction: disbelief, sadness, anger, confusion. How could someone so beloved, so iconic, meet such a fate? How could the woman by his side, equally admired and respected, be swept into the same tragic end? But there's another layer to this story, one that makes it even more harrowing. Nick Reiner, the son, was not just a peripheral figure. He was the key to the mystery. The person whose actions would force the world to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the Reiners. His arrest and confession brought questions that had no easy answers. Was this a premeditated act? Was there a trigger, a breaking point that pushed him over the edge? Was this an isolated incident, or had warning signs been ignored for too long? Hollywood, for all its glamour and allure, has a long history of family tragedies. From inheritance disputes to public feuds, the industry has seen its share of heartbreak. But rarely does a story combine fame, familial intimacy, and unthinkable horror in a way that feels both incomprehensible and hauntingly human. The Reiner tragedy is not just a headline. It is a study in how appearances can be deceiving, how relationships can unravel, and how the very people we trust the most can sometimes harbor secrets we cannot imagine. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, there is also the question of motive, of understanding, of piecing together the puzzle. Investigators are poring over every detail: surveillance footage, phone records, private correspondence, witness statements. Each piece of evidence paints a clearer picture, but each also raises more questions. What did Nick feel leading up to that moment? What pressures, internal or external, had he been under? Was there a breaking point? And how did the people closest to him, friends, colleagues, even extended family, fail to see the signs? As the world waits for answers, one thing is undeniable. This story is about more than just a tragic event. It is about legacy, about the fragility of family, and about the shocking, unpredictable ways human behavior can manifest. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about trust, mental health, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs. And it makes us confront the terrifying reality that sometimes the people we love most are capable of acts that defy comprehension. So, as we begin to unravel the details of Rob and Michelle Reiner's deaths, we must prepare ourselves for a journey that is as unsettling as it is compelling. We will explore the lives of these individuals, the circumstances that led to their untimely deaths, and the shocking confession that has left the world in disbelief. We will look at the public's reaction, the media frenzy, and the ongoing investigation that seeks to uncover the full truth. And as we do, we will be asking the questions that everyone is asking. How could this happen? Why did it happen? And what does it mean for the family, for Hollywood, and for us? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The confession, the details of the act, the hidden tensions within the family, all of it would reveal a side of the Reiners that the world never knew existed. And as shocking as the initial discovery was, it would soon become clear that the full story is even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. What do you really know about someone whose name is on every marquee, whose films have shaped your childhood, your adolescence, your adult life? We all think we know Rob Reiner, the Hollywood icon. We've seen him on the red carpet, applauded his work, laughed at his films, marveled at his storytelling. But do we truly know the man behind the camera? The man whose life has now ended in a way that no one could have predicted? Rob Reiner's career spanned decades. From the darkly satirical This Is Spinal Tap to the emotional depth of Stand By Me and the courtroom intensity of A Few Good Men, he wasn't just a filmmaker. He was a storyteller who could capture the raw essence of humanity. Each of his films carried a piece of his soul, a fragment of his observations about life, society, and the human condition. Audiences loved him because he wasn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. He could make you laugh, cry, and reflect, sometimes all in the same scene. But beyond the accolades and awards, there was Rob the man. Not Rob the director, not Rob the celebrity, but Rob the husband, the father, the neighbor. And this is where the story becomes more than just about Hollywood fame. It's about intimacy, about the people we let into our lives, and the secrets that dwell behind closed doors. Neighbors in Rob Reiner's upscale Los Angeles community often spoke of him as approachable, friendly, almost unassuming despite his fame. People would wave, say hello, and he would wave back with a genuine smile. Yet, behind that smile, behind the polite nods and courteous hellos, was a man whose private life was far more complicated than anyone could imagine. Michelle Reiner, 68, was not just a supportive spouse. She was a partner who balanced Rob's chaotic creative world with stability and love. She understood the pressures of Hollywood, the constant scrutiny, and the high stakes of living in the public eye. Friends who knew them well described Michelle as sharp, kind, and unwaveringly loyal. She was the quiet strength behind Rob's brilliance, the grounding force that held the family together. Together, they were the picture of Hollywood success, enviable, glamorous, seemingly untouchable. And yet, appearances can be deceiving. For every red carpet photo, every glowing interview, there was a life lived behind closed doors, a life that, for all its external perfection, was riddled with complexities, tensions, and unspoken conflicts. Rob Reiner was a father, yes, but he was also a man with expectations, ambitions, and, like any human being, flaws. The dynamic within the Reiner household, as investigators and friends would later reveal, was not as simple as outsiders believed. Let's talk about Nick Reiner. Nick, the son, the man whose actions would forever alter the way the world remembers this family. For years, he was just Nick, Rob Reiner's son, a figure in the background of the Hollywood narrative. But as the tragic events unfolded, the focus shifted. Nick was arrested, and soon, details about his upbringing, his relationship with his parents, and his mental state began to surface. People were asking, how could someone so close to Rob and Michelle commit such an unthinkable act? What could possibly push a son to such extremes? Understanding Nick requires understanding the environment he grew up in. Hollywood is not an ordinary world. It's a world of pressure, of expectation, of constant judgment. For the children of famous parents, the challenges are amplified. They grow up in a bubble of attention, scrutiny, and sometimes unrealistic expectations. And while many navigate it successfully, others struggle under the weight. Nick, according to those close to the family, was no exception. He had moments of brilliance and charm, yes, but also signs of isolation, frustration, and internal conflict. Small tensions that seemed trivial to outsiders could have been significant undercurrents in his mind. But what really happened inside the Reiner home? What pushed this seemingly typical Hollywood family into tragedy? This is where the story becomes a web of unanswered questions. Investigators discovered patterns, conversations, behaviors that painted a complex portrait of a family struggling behind closed doors. Conflicts over inheritance, disagreements over career choices, subtle frictions in daily life. Each might seem inconsequential alone, but together, they formed a pressure cooker environment. And then there was the mansion itself. A sprawling, beautiful home in one of Los Angeles's most desirable neighborhoods. The house represented everything the Reiners had built: success, comfort, status. But it also became the setting for a horrifying event. In a place where laughter, celebration, and creative energy once filled the rooms, tragedy struck. The very walls that held so many memories would now hold the weight of a crime that no one could have imagined. It's also essential to understand Hollywood's fascination with legacy. Rob Reiner was not just building films. He was building a story that would outlive him. And as parents, Rob and Michelle were building a legacy for Nick. But legacy is complicated. It can be a source of pride, yes, but also a source of pressure and tension. Expectations can be heavy, invisible burdens. Was Nick struggling under that weight? Did he feel trapped by his parents' vision of him, their standards, or the world's perception of him? These are questions investigators and psychologists would ask in the days following the tragedy. Neighbors have described seeing Rob walking his dog, greeting friends, attending community events. On the surface, he was the neighbor everyone admired. Michelle, too, was seen attending charity events, organizing community projects, and participating in social functions. Everything seemed perfect, but we've learned over and over that public personas are carefully curated. The mansion may have been pristine, the smiles genuine, but the private interactions, the tension behind closed doors, often tell a very different story. Friends and colleagues also weighed in. Some spoke of minor disagreements between Nick and his parents. Others hinted at long-standing frictions that had never been publicized. But no one could predict what would come next. No one could foresee that the events of that fateful day would shake Hollywood to its core. The shock was compounded by the fact that Rob Reiner had been such a beloved figure. His films weren't just successful, they were cultural touchstones. People felt as though a part of their childhood and adult life had been tarnished by tragedy. It's important to pause here and reflect. Why does this story grip us so intensely? Why does the world fixate on Hollywood tragedies, on the failures of famous families? Part of it is proximity, the sense that if it can happen to them, it can happen anywhere. Another part is the stark contrast between expectation and reality. We see wealth, success, and fame, and we assume it shields people from suffering. But the Reiner tragedy reminds us that no amount of money, talent, or public admiration can prevent heartbreak, betrayal, or tragedy. And yet, there is something haunting about the idea that this family story was unfolding in plain sight. The smiles, the appearances, the perfectly polished exterior, they were all part of the narrative. But tragedy, as it often does, doesn't care about appearances. It breaks through walls, both literal and metaphorical. And when it does, it leaves behind a world forever changed. We must also consider Michelle Reiner in all of this. Too often, stories focus solely on the actions of one individual. But Michelle was an essential figure, a life partner, and a mother. Her death is not just a footnote in a sensational story, it is a devastating loss. She was a stabilizing force, a person whose wisdom and insight were integral to the family's functioning. What must it have been like for her in those final moments? For Rob, for Michelle, and for the household that had known love, creativity, and connection? As the investigation unfolded, details emerged that painted a picture of an environment far more complex than anyone initially imagined. Police reports, interviews with neighbors, and statements from friends began to reveal subtle dynamics. Arguments that seemed minor at the time, moments of withdrawal or tension, signs that something was off. None of these individually predicted the horror that was about to happen, but collectively, they created a pattern, a backdrop against which tragedy would strike. So here we are, looking at a Hollywood legend whose life and work we've admired, a devoted spouse who kept a household running smoothly, and a son whose actions would send shockwaves across the world. The mansion in Los Angeles, once a symbol of success and stability, had become the site of an unfathomable tragedy. And as the public struggled to comprehend what had happened, investigators were piecing together the narrative, uncovering details that were as heartbreaking as they were shocking. And yet, as compelling as the initial discovery was, it was only the beginning. The arrest of Nick Reiner opened a Pandora's box of questions. Confession details, motives, family history, psychological state, all would be scrutinized, analyzed, and debated. And as the layers peeled back, the story became increasingly complex, revealing that what the world had initially seen was only a fraction of the truth. But the real question that lingers, and the one that sets the stage for the next chapter, is this: how did a family so seemingly normal, so outwardly perfect, descend into this tragedy? How did the dynamics within the Reiner household contribute to an event that would shock Hollywood and the world at large? And perhaps most importantly, what secrets were hidden behind those walls that no one outside the family could see? The answers are coming, piece by piece. And what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about fame, family, and tragedy. But even as we begin to peel back the layers, one thing is clear. The story of Rob Reiner and his family is far from over. And the deeper we go, the more shocking it becomes. Sunday morning in Los Angeles dawned like any other. The sun glimmered off the palm trees, the birds chirped in quiet neighborhoods, and people went about their routines, unaware that in one stately mansion on a tree-lined street, the world was about to stop. Rob Reiner, Hollywood legend, and his wife Michelle, 68, would not live to see the day unfold. And when the news broke, it reverberated across the city, across the nation, and across the globe. It wasn't just a story of tragedy. It was a story that shattered the very idea of safety, of normalcy, and of trust within families. It all began with a frantic 911 call. The details of that call, later released in part to the media, were chilling. Voices were shaking, frantic, trying to describe a situation that seemed impossible. "Please, you have to send someone. It's my parents. Something's happened. I don't know what to do," the caller reportedly said. Neighbors looked out their windows, straining to see what was happening. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping the air above the quiet suburban streets. Reporters began gathering, cameras ready, capturing every moving car, every flashing light, every emergency responder that sped down the street. Within minutes, the story spread like wildfire. Rob Reiner and Michelle had been found dead inside their Los Angeles home. At first, speculation ran rampant. Some assumed a tragic accident, perhaps a gas leak, perhaps a fall. Others considered the possibility of a break-in. But as details trickled in, it became clear that this was not an accident. The horror that unfolded was deliberate, intentional, and unthinkable. And then the unimaginable happened. The police confirmed that their son, Nick Reiner, was in custody. Not a stranger, not a burglar, not a rival, his own son. He had confessed to committing what authorities later described in hushed, careful language as an abomination. The arrest sent shockwaves not just through the neighborhood. To understand the gravity of the moment, you have to step into that neighborhood, into that mansion, into the shock that rippled through everyone who knew the family. Neighbors described a home that was always orderly, welcoming, a place of quiet dignity. It was the kind of house that made people feel safe, inspired, and even a little awestruck. And yet, inside, a tragedy had unfolded that no one could have predicted. The same walls that had heard laughter, conversation, and music were now the site of unimaginable loss. Friends and colleagues of Rob Reiner rushed to process the news. Hollywood was in shock. Messages of grief poured in from actors, directors, and fans alike. Social media erupted with disbelief, sorrow, and anger. Some struggled to reconcile the image of Rob as the genial, brilliant director with the grim reality of his death. Others were struck by the almost cinematic horror of the situation. A Hollywood icon and his wife found dead, their son arrested, a confession that seemed plucked straight from a crime thriller. And yet, as the initial shock began to settle, questions multiplied. What had led to this moment? Was it sudden, impulsive, a flash of uncontrollable rage? Or was it something that had been simmering for years, unnoticed, unspoken, ignored? Investigators were already on the scene, combing through the mansion for clues. Every detail mattered. Footprints, phone records, private correspondence, even the slightest inconsistency in witness statements could be the key to understanding the tragedy. The scene inside the mansion, as described by first responders, was haunting. Personal belongings scattered, signs of struggle, traces of a life violently interrupted. And yet, the true horror was not the physical evidence. It was the realization that this was not the work of a stranger. This was not a random act of violence. It was familial, intimate, and almost impossible to comprehend. The people who had nurtured, guided, and loved Nick Reiner had been struck down by him. Media outlets scrambled to cover the story. Headlines were sensational. Hollywood tragedy, Rob Reiner and wife dead, son arrested. From Hollywood fame to family horror. The Reiner case, beloved director and wife found dead in Los Angeles mansion, son confesses. But for every headline, there was a deeper question. What had happened inside that house? What could drive a son to commit such a heinous act against his parents? Public fascination with the case grew exponentially. Forums, social media threads, and talk shows buzzed with speculation. Fans of Reiner's work were grappling with a complicated mix of grief, shock, and disbelief. How could someone whose art brought so much joy to millions be at the center of such horror? And how could someone so close to him, his own flesh and blood, be responsible? Investigators began piecing together the timeline of events leading up to the tragedy. Calls, movements, interactions, all were scrutinized. There were no easy answers. There were no clear warning signs, at least not ones visible to outsiders. And yet, detectives noticed subtle patterns, minor tensions, and interactions that, in hindsight, hinted at underlying familial stress. Arguments over money, disagreements about lifestyle choices, unspoken resentments. All of these factors, small as they might seem, contributed to an environment that ultimately exploded into disaster. The arrest of Nick Reiner marked a turning point. Until that moment, people were grappling with shock. After the arrest, the conversation shifted to motive, mental state, and accountability. Psychologists, criminologists, and legal experts weighed in. Was this an impulsive act? Was it the culmination of years of underlying psychological strain? Or was it something even more calculated, something premeditated? Nick's background and upbringing were examined intensely. He grew up in a household of privilege, yes, but also of expectation. Hollywood is not an easy environment to navigate, especially for the children of famous parents. The pressures are unique, intense, and often invisible to the outside world. Friends noted that Nick had moments of withdrawal, of frustration, and at times, isolation. Yet no one imagined he was capable of such a horrifying act. And this disconnect, the gap between appearance and reality, is what made the tragedy all the more shocking. Meanwhile, the public struggled to process the human side of the story. Rob and Michelle were not just public figures. They were individuals who had lived full, complex lives. They had friends, passions, memories, and legacies that were now abruptly halted. Their deaths were not just events. They were ruptures in the fabric of countless lives. Fans mourned not just the loss of films, but the loss of inspiration, mentorship, and connection that the Reiners had offered to the world. And yet, even amid the grief and horror, the story was far from over. Each detail that emerged only deepened the mystery. What exactly had led to the fateful confrontation inside the mansion? What did Nick's confession reveal, and what did it leave out? Were there other family tensions that the public would never know about? These questions hovered over the case like a dark cloud, ensuring that the world's fascination would not fade anytime soon. The day of the discovery marked the beginning of a story that would continue to unfold for weeks, months, and perhaps years. Police investigations, media coverage, and public scrutiny would peel back layer after layer of the Reiner's life, revealing complexities that no one outside the family could have imagined. And as each new detail emerged, the world would be forced to grapple with the unfathomable reality that the tragedy was not random, not external, but deeply intimate. So, as the city of Los Angeles and the world at large absorbed the initial shock, one thing became clear. This was not just a story of fame, fortune, or tragedy. It was a story about family, about the delicate and often invisible threads that hold relationships together, and about how those threads can unravel in ways that no one sees coming. And as we continue to peel back the layers of this shocking event, one question looms over all others. What truly happened inside the Reiner mansion that morning? What led a son to commit an act that would forever stain his family's legacy? Who is Nick Reiner? The son of Rob and Michelle, the man whose actions would shock the world, the individual who transformed a family tragedy into a headline that would dominate news cycles for weeks. For years, he was mostly a footnote in the public narrative, a son of a Hollywood legend, living in the shadows of fame. But suddenly, the focus shifted entirely onto him. And now, the question everyone is asking is, how well did anyone really know Nick? Nick Reiner grew up surrounded by privilege, yes. His father, Rob, had a career that spanned decades, creating films that were celebrated worldwide. His mother, Michelle, offered stability, warmth, and guidance, nurturing the family while Rob navigated the pressures of Hollywood. On the surface, Nick had everything a young person could want: opportunities, comfort, education, and access to the elite circles of the entertainment world. Friends described him as intelligent, articulate, and occasionally charming. He could carry a conversation about films, politics, or social issues with ease. But as is often the case in families with high public visibility, appearances can be deceiving. Privilege doesn't inoculate someone from mental health struggles, familial tension, or internal conflict. Those who knew Nick intimately noticed subtle signs. Moments of withdrawal, periods of irritability, instances where he seemed frustrated or resentful. Yet, these signs were often dismissed as typical adolescent or young adult behavior, or as the inevitable frustrations of living under the shadow of celebrity. No one imagined that these small fissures could erupt into something so catastrophic. Friends and classmates painted a complex portrait of Nick. In school, he was bright and capable, but occasionally distant. Teachers recalled a student who could be enthusiastic and engaged one day, and withdrawn the next. Peer relationships were sometimes rocky. Nick had friends, but he also had moments of isolation. At home, according to some reports, he had a complicated relationship with his parents. Rob was demanding at times, not in a cruel way, but with high expectations. Michelle tried to mediate, to offer understanding and support, But even the most loving guidance can falter when tensions simmer quietly over years. Mental health professionals who later examined aspects of the case speculated about potential underlying conditions, anxiety, depression, and perhaps unresolved anger. But what is striking is how little of this was visible to outsiders. Hollywood families often maintain a carefully curated image. Publicly, Nick might have appeared like any other son of a celebrity, attending events, maintaining a social presence, and participating in family activities. Privately, however, the dynamics were far more complex, marked by struggles and frustrations that, while subtle, were significant. In his 20s, Nick tried to carve out his own identity. He pursued interests that were not directly tied to his father's fame, attempting to build a life separate from the constant comparisons and expectations. Some friends described him as ambitious yet conflicted, someone striving for independence but still tethered to a family legacy he could never fully escape. He had moments of brilliance, moments of promise, but also moments of inexplicable anger or emotional withdrawal. These contradictions would later become a focal point in understanding the tragic events that unfolded. Neighbors also had observations about Nick that painted a picture of a man living in two worlds. On one hand, he was part of a seemingly ordinary neighborhood. He walked dogs, waved to neighbors, participated in local activities. On the other hand, he was connected to Hollywood circles, parties, and events that most of the public would only see from afar. The juxtaposition of normal suburban life with the pressures of celebrity exposure created a tension that few could fully comprehend. As investigators began to dig deeper, they uncovered interactions, arguments, and moments that offered insights into Nick's state of mind. Small disputes with his parents over finances, lifestyle choices, and expectations became magnified under the microscope of a tragic investigation. Was there a breaking point, a trigger that caused these tensions to explode? Evidence would later suggest that multiple factors converged in a way that no single event could have predicted, creating a perfect storm that culminated in the unthinkable. The arrest itself brought the world face to face with Nick in a way that nothing before had. For years, he had been largely invisible to the public. Suddenly, he was the central figure in a story that gripped the world. News outlets broadcast images, interviews with acquaintances surfaced, and social media exploded with speculation. People wanted to understand him, not just the son of Rob Reiner, but the individual capable of committing such an act. And yet, understanding someone in such a complex, emotionally charged situation is never simple. Nick's personal history became a subject of intense scrutiny. From his schooling to his adult life, investigators sought patterns. Moments of isolation, instances of anger, struggles with identity, and challenges navigating the pressures of fame. Each detail added another layer to the portrait of a man who, despite all appearances, was grappling with forces, internal and external, that no one could fully see. These details, small as they might seem, were crucial in piecing together the events that led to that fateful day. Psychologists analyzing the situation noted something critical. Family tragedies like this often do not happen in isolation. They are the culmination of long-term patterns, unresolved conflicts, and emotional strain. Nick's case was no exception. His actions were horrifying, yes, but they were also the result of a complex web of influences, personal, familial, and societal, that converged in an explosive way. Understanding these factors does not excuse his actions, it contextualizes them, providing insight into how such a tragedy could occur. At the same time, the public was forced to grapple with the human element. Nick was a son, not just a perpetrator. He had relationships, experiences, and emotions that were integral to his story. Friends recalled a young man capable of kindness, humor, and creativity. They also recalled moments of tension, withdrawal, and unpredictability. The contradictions in his behavior became a central theme in understanding the tragedy. How could the same individual who showed charm, intelligence, and humor also commit such an unthinkable act? This duality would perplex investigators, friends, and the public alike. Family dynamics are often invisible to outsiders. What happens behind closed doors, away from cameras and public appearances, can be dramatically different from what the world perceives. Nick's relationship with Rob and Michelle, though rooted in love, also carried expectations, frustrations, and unresolved conflicts. Arguments that seemed minor in the moment may have left deep emotional scars. Opportunities for communication may have been missed. And sometimes, the pressure of familial expectation can reach a breaking point that no one outside the home can anticipate. As the investigation progressed, more details about Nick's interactions with his parents emerged. Private messages, phone calls, and witness accounts painted a picture of a household filled with tension and complexity. It became clear that the tragedy was not a simple act of violence. It was the culmination of years of unseen emotional struggles. Friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the image of the charming, intelligent Nick they knew with the son capable of devastating his family. The cognitive dissonance was profound, leaving many to question. How well do we ever really know those closest to us? The story of Nick Reiner is a story of contradiction, of duality, and of tragedy. He was a son, a young man navigating the pressures of a famous family, struggling with internal conflicts that were largely invisible to the outside world. He was intelligent, capable, and at times, charismatic. Yet he was also someone who, under pressure, would commit an act that shattered lives and stunned the world. Understanding Nick requires understanding both sides, the public persona and the private turmoil, the brilliance and the breakdown, the love and the anger. And so, as the world tried to make sense of the Reiner tragedy, one question lingered above all others. How could a son, raised in love and privilege, capable of so much potential, commit such a horrific act? The answer would begin to emerge through a combination of investigation, psychological analysis, and piecing together the timeline leading up to the tragedy. But even as pieces of the puzzle surfaced, the complexity of the situation became increasingly clear. What drove Nick to this point? Was it a single moment of rage, or a lifetime of unresolved tension? Were there warning signs that were missed, ignored, or misunderstood? Could this have been prevented, or was it an inevitable collision of circumstances? These questions loomed over the investigation and captivated the public imagination. And while answers would gradually come to light, the true nature of Nick Reiner, the person, the son, the actor in this tragic drama, remained elusive, complex, and deeply troubling. Imagine the moment when the world shifts. The moment when shock turns into disbelief, disbelief turns into horror, and horror turns into a relentless search for answers. For the Reiner family, that moment came on a quiet Sunday morning in Los Angeles when police arrived at the mansion and took Nick Reiner into custody. It wasn't just any arrest. It was the arrest that would dominate headlines, dominate social media, and dominate the collective psyche of a nation. The mansion, once a sanctuary of Hollywood prestige and familial warmth, had become a crime scene. Officers described the property as meticulously maintained, almost deceptively ordinary, masking the chaos and tragedy that had unfolded within. Inside, the evidence of a violent act was unmistakable. Personal items were disarranged, signs of struggle evident, and the air thick with an unsettling stillness that first responders described as chilling. The realization hit hard. This was not a robbery, not a random incident. It was deliberate, and the person responsible was inside the family. Nick Reiner, the son, was cooperative but visibly shaken. According to preliminary reports, he made a statement that left investigators stunned. He confessed. Not in fragments, not in riddles, not ambiguously. He admitted to committing the act that ended the lives of his father, Rob Reiner, 78, and his mother, Michelle, 68. The confession itself would become a central piece of the case, a document that detailed events, motives, and moments leading to an unimaginable crime. And yet, the more investigators learned, the more complex the story became. From the outset, authorities faced the difficult task of piecing together a sequence of events that made little sense on the surface. How did the confrontation begin? What escalated it to the point of no return? Witnesses later recounted a series of interactions, both subtle and intense, that painted a picture of a family under pressure. Some argued over finances, others over personal choices, and in the midst of it all, underlying tensions, perhaps long ignored, boiled to the surface. By the time law enforcement arrived, the scene was tragically complete. Public reaction was immediate and visceral. News outlets flashed the story across screens. Nick Reiner arrested after confessing to parents' deaths. Hollywood stunned by Reiner family tragedy. Son confesses in shocking Los Angeles murder case. Social media erupted with speculation, disbelief, and grief. Fans of Rob Reiner's work were particularly shaken. This was the man whose films had brought them laughter, tears, and inspiration. And now, the very family that seemed untouchable was shattered in a single morning. The confession itself was harrowing, though details were initially withheld from the public to preserve the integrity of the investigation. Investigators confirmed that Nick had admitted to both premeditated actions and moments of intense emotional conflict. They described his demeanor as distraught but coherent, a combination that made the confession both chilling and tragically human. For psychologists, criminologists, and the public alike, the focus shifted from the act itself to the person behind it. How could someone capable of articulating their actions calmly in a statement also carry out something so heinous? As news of the arrest spread, reporters and analysts began digging into Nick's background, attempting to understand the man who could commit such a crime. Friends described contradictions. Moments of charm and intelligence alongside periods of isolation and anger. Teachers recalled a young man who alternated between brilliance and withdrawal. Neighbors observed a son who seemed ordinary, friendly even, but whose private life was unknowable. These contradictions added to the shock. How could the son everyone knew appear so normal while harboring the capacity for such violence? Authorities also revealed that Nick's confession contained critical details about the moments leading up to the crime. While some of these details remained sealed to protect the investigation, they painted a disturbing picture of a family fraught with tension. Arguments, emotional strain, and possibly long-standing resentments all seemed to converge on that tragic morning. Investigators emphasized that the act was not impulsive in the classic sense. It was a product of accumulated emotional pressure, triggered by a combination of interpersonal conflicts and internal struggles. The legal implications were immediate and profound. With a confession in hand, prosecutors had a crucial piece of evidence that would shape the trial and public perception. Yet, even with this evidence, questions remained. Why did Nick act when he did? Could the tragedy have been prevented? And how did a seemingly ordinary family, wealthy, intelligent, and successful, arrive at such a devastating endpoint? Legal analysts speculated about mental health defenses, degrees of culpability, and the possible outcomes of a trial that would attract worldwide attention. The arrest also highlighted the role of mental health in tragedies like this. Experts discussed how long-term stress, unresolved conflict, and potential psychiatric conditions could create conditions for catastrophic behavior. They emphasized that such factors do not excuse violence, but they do offer insight into how someone could reach the point of committing an unthinkable act. Nick Reiner, in the wake of his confession, became both a subject of legal scrutiny and psychological analysis, a man whose mind and motivations were now under an unrelenting spotlight. Friends and colleagues of the Reiners spoke out, struggling to reconcile what they knew with what had happened. Many described shock, disbelief, and grief. They recounted moments with Nick as a son, a friend, and a young man navigating a complex world. And yet, as they spoke, the shadow of the confession loomed large. No one could ignore the devastating reality. Rob and Michelle were gone, and Nick had admitted responsibility. Meanwhile, the mansion itself became a focal point of public fascination. Reporters and neighbors described the home as almost ordinary, despite its Hollywood pedigree. The contrast between the elegant exterior and the horror inside captured public imagination, emphasizing the idea that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in spaces that appear safe and controlled. The mansion, once a symbol of family success and stability, now stood as a silent witness to one of the most shocking events in recent Hollywood history. The confession also raised ethical and moral questions that extended far beyond the immediate tragedy. How do we balance accountability with understanding? How do we process grief when the perpetrator is a family member? And how do we, as a society, grapple with the realization that familial love and violence are not always mutually exclusive? These questions would dominate conversations in the weeks and months following the arrest, compelling both experts and the public to confront uncomfortable truths. For law enforcement, the confession was both a breakthrough and a challenge. While it provided clarity about the immediate events, it also opened up new avenues of investigation. Investigators needed to verify details, examine motives, and ensure that the confession was complete and accurate. Every piece of evidence was scrutinized: the timeline of events, interactions between Nick and his parents, and even subtle behavioral cues leading up to the tragedy. The goal was to construct a comprehensive understanding of what had occurred and why. The media, of course, capitalized on every revelation. Cable news, online platforms, and newspapers ran exhaustive coverage, broadcasting images of the Reiners, reporting details of the arrest, and analyzing the implications of the confession. Social media amplified the story exponentially, with users expressing shock, grief, and outrage. The combination of celebrity, family drama, and unthinkable violence created a perfect storm for public fascination. Yet amid the public spectacle, the human dimension of the story remained profound. Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner were more than celebrities. They were parents, friends, and community members whose lives touched countless others. Their deaths left a void that cannot be measured merely in headlines. And Nick, as the son at the center of the tragedy, embodies the complexity of human behavior, the capacity for brilliance and for devastation, often in the same individual. And so, as we examine the confession in more detail, we begin to uncover layers of motivation, emotion, and conflict that paint a more complete, if still deeply disturbing, picture. Each revelation offers insight into the Reiner family, into Nick's psyche, and into the circumstances that culminated in a tragedy that stunned the world. The arrest and confession are not the end of the story. They are the gateway to understanding, to piecing together how such a catastrophic event unfolded in a family that appeared, to the outside world, to have everything. But even with the confession in hand, mysteries remain. What triggered the act at that exact moment? Were there prior incidents that hinted at the potential for violence? And perhaps most chillingly, what does this tragedy reveal about the fragility of family bonds, no matter how strong they appear on the surface? The Reiner Mansion, a sprawling, elegant home nestled in one of Los Angeles's most exclusive neighborhoods, a place that had been a symbol of prestige, success, and family life. But on that fateful morning, it became a crime scene, a repository of chilling evidence, and a silent witness to a tragedy that would shock the world. Stepping inside, investigators were immediately struck by the contrast. The home was immaculate, curated, almost perfectly staged, yet it concealed a chaos that no amount of outward order could hide. The first responders described a house that was eerily quiet, almost frozen in time. The air was heavy, the rooms undisturbed except for subtle signs of struggle. Personal items were slightly out of place, books scattered, a vase knocked off a table, but nothing immediately screamed violence. And yet, the investigators knew better. Every detail mattered. Every misplaced object, every subtle disruption could offer clues to the events that had unfolded. One of the first pieces of evidence collected was the 911 call. Investigators listened repeatedly, noting the tremor in the caller's voice, the urgency, the confusion. These audio recordings would become central in reconstructing the timeline. By analyzing the tone, the pauses, and the exact words used, investigators could begin to understand the sequence of events that led to the tragic act. It wasn't just what was said, it was what was unsaid, the hesitations and fragmented sentences that hinted at panic, fear, and realization. Rooms were meticulously examined. The living room, often a space of family gathering, now bore the subtle marks of confrontation. Chairs were slightly askew, a throw blanket displaced, a lamp tilted at an unusual angle. Investigators theorized that these small disruptions could indicate moments of struggle or hesitation. Moments where decisions were made, tempers flared, and irreversible actions were taken. Every object told a story. Every space contained a fragment of a puzzle. The kitchen, often considered the heart of a home, revealed further insights. Investigators noted minor disturbances, objects slightly out of place, and signs that an argument may have started or escalated in this room. Family homes, while places of warmth, also become stages where emotional intensity peaks. Meals shared or interrupted, conversations that escalate, minor slights that trigger deeper resentment. All of these small interactions can culminate in disaster. In the Reiner mansion, investigators were seeing the aftermath of precisely such a convergence. Perhaps the most telling evidence came from the bedrooms. Rob and Michelle's personal spaces, sanctuaries of privacy, were found largely intact, yet investigators discovered subtle indicators of tension. A chair pulled out as if in haste, items on the bedside table shifted, and faint scuff marks on the carpet. In high-profile cases, investigators know that the scene often tells a story more vividly than witnesses. Here, the quiet details whispered a narrative of confrontation, emotion, and escalation. Investigators also focused heavily on digital evidence. Phones, computers, and communication devices were seized and meticulously examined. Text messages, emails, and call logs revealed conversations between Nick and his parents that provided context for the tension leading up to the tragedy. Financial disputes, lifestyle disagreements, and subtle expressions of frustration emerged from these communications, offering insight into the underlying dynamics that may have contributed to the catastrophic events. Security footage played a critical role as well. While parts of the mansion had surveillance cameras, many were positioned for exterior monitoring rather than interior oversight. Nevertheless, what little footage existed captured fleeting moments: Nick entering or leaving rooms, interactions in common areas, and the subtle body language that investigators would analyze for clues. These frames, often lasting only seconds, became invaluable in reconstructing the timeline and understanding the escalation of events. The investigators also employed forensic specialists to examine trace evidence. Fingerprints, DNA swabs, and microscopic fibers were meticulously cataloged. Each fragment of evidence, no matter how small, was analyzed for its significance. Could a displaced object indicate a struggle? Could a fingerprint on a surface reveal a sudden movement or action? These small details, while seemingly insignificant to the casual observer, were central to piecing together a coherent narrative of what transpired inside the mansion. One of the most haunting discoveries was a series of notes and personal writings found in Rob and Michelle's home office. These notes, some penned by the couple, others possibly drafted by Nick, offered insight into family dynamics and personal thoughts. Investigators tread carefully, recognizing the sensitivity of private writings, but the content suggested underlying tension, unspoken grievances, and at times, hints of familial strain. While these writings alone did not explain the act, they contributed to the broader picture, revealing the complex emotional landscape within the household. Neighbors also provided crucial testimony. Their observations, seemingly mundane at first, offered context. Accounts of unusual behavior, quiet arguments, or periods of isolation for Nick painted a backdrop that investigators could not ignore. These external perspectives, combined with the physical evidence within the mansion, created a multifaceted view of the household, a place that, from the outside, seemed serene but inside harbored layers of tension and complexity. The mansion itself, in its elegance and perfection, underscored a chilling truth: appearances can be deceiving. A home can be beautiful, orderly, and outwardly calm while concealing emotional volatility and interpersonal conflict. Investigators often note that the most tragic events frequently occur in environments that seem ordinary or even idyllic. The Reiner mansion, with its immaculate design and carefully curated aesthetic, became a stark reminder of this phenomenon. As the investigation progressed, forensic psychologists were brought in to interpret behavioral patterns indicated by the evidence. Items moved or displaced, the order of certain objects, and the subtle signs of stress in the home environment suggested moments of emotional escalation, hesitation, and perhaps even remorse. These analyses helped build a narrative that went beyond physical evidence, exploring the psychological landscape that preceded the tragedy. One of the most compelling elements of the evidence was the contrast between the outwardly normal and the inwardly chaotic. To a casual observer, the Reiner home appeared as a sanctuary, a place of comfort and success. Yet the investigation revealed a home where tension simmered beneath the surface, a microcosm of emotional strain, where small conflicts may have escalated unnoticed until they reached a breaking point. And then there were the personal effects: clothing, family photos, memorabilia from decades of work and life. These items were more than just possessions. They were pieces of a narrative, artifacts of a life lived in public and private spheres. The placement, movement, and condition of these items provided subtle clues, helping investigators reconstruct the timeline and the interpersonal dynamics that led to the tragedy. As law enforcement and forensic teams meticulously combed the mansion, each room, each item, each fragment of evidence told a story. It was a story of family, of tension, of love and frustration intertwined. The mansion, in its silence, became a key witness, a place where the smallest detail could reveal the largest truth. And every discovery, every observation, brought investigators closer to understanding the incomprehensible, the events that led Nick Reiner to commit an act that would forever alter his family and the world's perception of them. But even as evidence mounted, questions lingered. What did the arrangement of the home reveal about the final moments? Were there early warning signs that might have indicated the potential for tragedy? And perhaps most importantly, how could such an outwardly normal, seemingly stable household harbor the emotional conditions that culminated in this devastating act? The answers to these questions would continue to unfold, piece by piece, as investigators delved deeper into the physical, digital, and psychological evidence from the mansion. And while the details provided critical insight, the full story, what truly happened in those final moments, remained just out of reach, tantalizing investigators and the public alike. Every family has its secrets. Some are harmless, trivial, or even endearing, like hidden childhood journals or forgotten letters tucked away in an attic. Others are darker, more complex, and capable of reshaping lives when revealed. In the Reiner family, these secrets were not just whispered tales. They were threads woven into the very fabric of their household, threads that investigators now believed had contributed to the tragic events that left the world reeling. The first hint that there was more beneath the surface came from the investigation of Nick's confession. While he admitted to the act itself, the details he provided were selective. Certain conversations, disputes, and emotional triggers were mentioned only in passing, leaving law enforcement and forensic psychologists wondering what had truly fueled his actions. In families, these hidden pressures often simmer quietly, invisible to outsiders, and even sometimes invisible to those living inside them. But they leave traces, clues that can be found in digital communications, personal writings, and even the subtle behavior patterns of family members. Investigators soon began uncovering layers of family history that had never been publicly known. Financial tensions, for instance, emerged as a recurring theme. While Rob Reiner had a career that spanned decades, generating wealth and acclaim, money was reportedly a source of subtle but persistent conflict within the household. Nick, now in his late 20s, had voiced frustration over personal spending limits, perceived inequities, and the sense that he was always living in the shadow of his father's financial decisions. These disputes, while perhaps minor to outsiders, created emotional friction that compounded over time. But it wasn't just money. There were conflicts over independence, identity, and personal choice. Friends and former acquaintances described Nick as a young man striving to carve out a life that was distinct from his parents' fame and influence. Yet even as he sought autonomy, subtle tensions emerged. Parents, naturally protective, were concerned about his decisions, while Nick interpreted this oversight as interference, judgment, or lack of trust. These dynamics, though familiar to many families, reached an intensity in the Reiner household that no outsider could have anticipated. Personal writings discovered in Rob and Michelle's home office revealed even more. Letters, notes, and journals hinted at unspoken struggles, moments of fear, disappointment, and emotional fatigue. Some entries suggested a desire for reconciliation, understanding, and connection, while others reflected frustration and helplessness in the face of familial tensions. These documents offered a rare, intimate glimpse into the private lives of a family known publicly for its warmth, creativity, and charm. And in these writings, investigators began to see patterns, repeated misunderstandings, emotional disconnects, and moments where communication had failed. The psychological dimensions of these secrets were equally compelling. Experts suggested that Nick may have experienced a cumulative emotional strain, a buildup of frustration, isolation, and unresolved tension. In the confines of a family home, where emotions are heightened and conflicts are personal, small grievances can magnify over time. The tragedy that unfolded, they theorized, was not the result of a single incident, but the culmination of years of unnoticed or unaddressed stress. Even social relationships outside the family shed light on these hidden pressures. Friends and acquaintances revealed instances where Nick had expressed confusion, frustration, or resentment. Some described arguments that seemed trivial but were emotionally charged for him. Others mentioned periods of withdrawal, avoidance, or emotional volatility. Taken together, these observations painted a portrait of a young man grappling with intense internal conflict, navigating the complex expectations of family, and struggling to assert his independence in a household that, while loving, may have felt confining. Investigators also began to uncover long-standing emotional dynamics between Rob and Michelle that had, until now, been invisible to the public. While outwardly harmonious, the couple reportedly had their own disagreements and frustrations, often private, often suppressed. These dynamics, while normal in many families, may have inadvertently contributed to an environment where stress and tension simmered beneath the surface. Nick, as the middle figure in this intricate web, may have absorbed and internalized these pressures in ways that ultimately exploded in tragedy. The home itself, as investigators explored further, became a map of hidden tensions. Subtle details, a misplaced photograph, a letter left unopened, a stack of mail marked with frustration, revealed traces of the family's private struggles. Each item was a piece of a puzzle, helping investigators reconstruct the emotional landscape that existed before the tragic morning. These artifacts, seemingly mundane to an outsider, carried profound significance when viewed through the lens of family dynamics, psychological stress, and unspoken conflict. A particularly striking discovery was a series of digital messages between Nick and his parents in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Texts, emails, and social media exchanges revealed moments of disagreement over finances, lifestyle choices,